The content of this podcast has not been evaluated by Health Canada or the FDA. It is educational in nature and should not be taken as medical advice. Always consult a qualified medical professional to see if a diet, lifestyle change, or supplement is right for you. Any supplements mentioned are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Please note that the opinions of the guests or hosts are their own and may not reflect those of Advanced Orthomolecular Research Incorporated. Welcome to Supplementing Health, a podcast presented by Advanced Orthomolecular Research. We are all about applying evidence-based and effective dietary, lifestyle, and natural health product strategies for your optimal health. In each episode, we will feature very engaging clinicians and experts from the world of functional and naturopathic medicine to help achieve our mission to empower people to live their best lives naturally. The thyroid gland is a vital hormone gland. It plays a major role in the metabolism, growth, and development of the human body and helps regulate many body functions. Thyroid support is designed to support an underactive thyroid. It contains all of the necessary nutrients for optimal thyroid function, along with Ayurvedic herbs to enhance its activity. Get yours today at your local retailer or online at aor.ca. Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Supplementing Health. Today we're joined by Ashley Norris, registered holistic nutritionist, to discuss thyroid health and common disorders affecting this mighty organ. Ashley is the founder of Soulful Sprout Holistic Nutrition, which she created to offer her patients a different approach to health and their hormones. Welcome, Ashley.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So I wanted to kind of understand, what are the common forms of thyroid dysfunction that you see?
Yeah, so thyroid disorders, they affect our thyroid gland, which is, for anybody who's wondering, it's the butterfly-shaped gland in the front of our neck. And there are a few different types of thyroid disorders out there. So some that you may be familiar with, like hypothyroidism, which is the result of our thyroid gland producing insufficient amounts of thyroid hormone. There's also hyperthyroidism, which is where our gland starts to produce excessive amounts of the same hormone. It's a little bit less common and more commonly linked to Graves. Then we have goiters, which some people are familiar with, which is just an enlargement of our thyroid gland, really regardless of the root cause. A goiter could be associated with hypo or hyperthyroidism, and also a normal thyroid function. So you can have normally functioning thyroid hormones, but still have a goiter. Then there's nodules, which are typically associated with either benign tumors or thyroid cancer. And then, of course, last would be thyroid cancer. It's actually far more common in adult women than men, and about 2 out of 3 cases of people are under the age of 25. So it's really affecting a fairly young group of individuals. And there are a few different types of thyroid cancer out there. But overall, I'd say that's the big group of common forms of thyroid dysfunction that show up in clinic.
And what are some of the signs of diminished thyroid function that people should be watching out for?
Yeah, so it really depends. Obviously, each one of those thyroid imbalances have its own particular group of signs and symptoms, but overall to be watching out for fatigue, poor concentration, or what we call brain fog. And in clinic, I commonly hear clients refer to this as mummy brain as well. So just watching for the correlation between that. Really dry skin, sometimes hair loss, definitely digestive issues and constipation. Cold hands and feet or temperature changes, trouble regulating body temperature is a big sign of thyroid imbalance. Fluid retention, definitely the muscle and joint aches, and sometimes traveling into the mood world of depression, anxiety, and then starting to impact our hormones. So maybe excessive menstrual bleeding, heavy periods, or irregular periods as well.
Is there a reason people kind of correlate it with that mummy brain? Is there a tie between postpartum hormone shifts and thyroid issues?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm sure there's a lot of clinical research out there that does connect the two. Now, some people can have postpartum thyroid issues for sure. One study that I read, it tells that it mentioned that it takes about 2 years to replenish the amount of minerals lost during pregnancy. And so when we look at the importance of the role of minerals with thyroid function, it would make sense that our thyroid may be even slow down, or the function would be impaired slightly just because of the mineral imbalances postpartum as well. And then layered with the chronic stress and, the postpartum stresses of new transition into motherhood and things like that as well.
And outside of postpartum, there's estimates that say as many as 2 million Canadians have undiagnosed thyroid disease. So, what are some of the reasons that thyroid issues are so common nowadays?
Yeah, that's a great question. Truthfully, I think we can chalk it up to hustle culture and our fat and the pace at which our world operates. And to break that down even more, I would start with stress. So I just mentioned that mineral depletion is really important, especially things like magnesium, sodium, potassium, copper, and iodine. And so when stress levels go up in our day-to-day life, like they are for many people, it actually starts to deplete the minerals in our body quicker, and we tend to not have time to replenish those minerals either through food, basically through intentional renourishment. And so when those minerals start to go down, this will start to dysregulate our metabolism. We cannot create enough thyroid hormone oftentimes, and we'll also start to throw off our digestion. So it's sort of like a ripple effect back into why we're having more thyroid issues now is also related to modern agriculture. So we know that we are farming faster, and basically industrial agricultural is starting to strip our soils of minerals, especially iodine. And so these minerals are essential. They play an essential role in thyroid health and thyroid hormone production. And so if we're just not getting those in our daily diet, then our body doesn't have what it needs to truly continue function. So that's a kind of like the connection between stress and also remineralizing the body. But I would say overall, like, we're exposed to unprecedented amounts of chemicals in our day-to-day life. Those are toxins in our laundry detergents, in our cleaning agents, in our houses and workplaces, even in our clothing. Babies' clothing, our furniture is sprayed with lots of chemicals. And so having these chemicals on our food, in our homes, and on our skin is putting a burden. And the thyroid gland itself is really, really sensitive to toxins and heavy metals. So with the connection between, the rise of chemicals and in terms of industries and the stripping of our soils to rebalance the body, I feel like that's where a lot of these common imbalances start to pop up for the average person.
And we used to get iodine through our fortified salt, but a lot of people have started cutting salt out of their diet, knowing the correlation with high blood pressure and heart issues, or they're switching to mineral salts or other types of like pink Himalayan sea salt, that sort of thing. So,
Absolutely.
do you recommend then that people supplement to replace that, or are there other foods or ways to increase your iodine intake in your diet?
That's such a great question, and I'm so glad you raised that point. I think that, and I talk a lot with my clients about this, is like salt is not the enemy. And we've all gone through periods in terms of health and learning about things where we thought butter was the enemy, and then we learned that margarine wasn't the superior alternative in terms of cardiovascular health. And so I think we're learning that in terms of thyroid health right now, is that these Himalayan salts are really lacking some of the iodine that we otherwise need. So having a box of conventional table salt, in your kitchen, and using that when you're boiling your pasta or salting certain dishes, I think has a lot of benefit. And sometimes I'll tell my clients just to salt their water, because we tend to just be depleted in those minerals in general. So tiny little ways that we can add salt back into our diet, intentionally knowing that we're not heavily salting our food. Maybe the salt shaker isn't living on the table per se, but in our meal prep, we can consciously bring that in, I think is huge. And then also the rise of, I guess some people are more familiar with it and some aren't, but like incorporating seaweed into our diet. So dulse, wakame, sushi, using sushi paper and stuff like that in terms of snacks and meals is really important as well. Just any way that really works for you, that feels sustainable in terms of your lifestyle, but definitely trying to intentionally bring that iodine-rich foods back into your diet.
And you had mentioned that exposure to these toxic chemicals and toxic elements is also having an effect on our thyroid. And certain elements like bromine and cadmium can actually interfere with the uptake and utilization of those essential elements, namely iodine and actually selenium as well, which is really important for the thyroid and thyroid health. So, how do you see these relationships impacting thyroid disorders, and how can we be more conscious of our exposure to those two elements in particular, but also all the other chemicals that are interfering?
Yeah, I think nowadays we're talking more about the chemical load in our homes, and consumers are becoming more and more aware of these in conventional detergents and cleaning agents and exposure in general. So, one is just creating more space between us and those chemicals and toxins. So, not bringing them into your home, maybe using protective gloves and barriers where you do have to handle those chemicals. For example, if that's in the workplace and you don't have any other way to work around that, but just becoming aware of where those are in your day-to-day life and how to make more space between you and them. For a lot of people, that's leaning into some toxin-free or home cleaning agents as well, switching from fragrance things to non-fragrance things, your laundry detergents, soaps, and other chemical cleaners as well. So I would say that this is not an overnight fix. You know, this isn't something you're going to be able to snap your fingers and have this chemical-free, toxin-free life, but consciously cultivating that and, you know, being intentional. Maybe this month you're going to focus on getting those cleaning agents out of your kitchen, out from underneath your kitchen sink, and get curious of what else is out there in some of the health food stores or more health conscious retailers in terms of healthy swaps for you. One of my favorite places to look for more information on these types of chemicals and common things that we have in our home is Environmental Working Group's website. And so you can pop in a chemical maybe you come in contact with in the workplace if you're curious about it, and type in the name of it, and it will tell you what's in it, and then rank it in terms of toxic load, and if it is an endocrine disruptor, so if it will have an impact on your thyroid as well.
Awesome. Now, can thyroid issues be misdiagnosed?
For sure. And sometimes thyroid imbalances will show up in, so you may have a thyroid imbalance and it won't show up on blood work. And the way I explain this to my clients is in terms of conventional blood work labs, some doctors are not running a full panel for people, but also sometimes people are showing up just inside the line of fine. And what I mean by that, let's say a conventional lab range is between 2 and 5, and your blood work shows up at 2.1. Well, you're going to show up within normal range, but are you going to be feeling good? So there's this optimal range that we look at in terms of a lot of naturopaths and functional nutritionists look at this. And I call it the range, like the thriving range. And we call it the functional range in terms of blood work, is this is the space where you are actually thriving. Because do you want to live just inside the line of fine, or do you actually want to be energized, have a healthy metabolism, be able to digest your food and all of those things? So this is where we call it like subclinical thyroid. So it's not showing up clinically as a yes, but you are experiencing a lot of those symptoms. So sometimes people have thyroid symptoms that take a really long time before they get outside of that line of fine.
Was going to say another thing that I learned too from my past life in the lab world is that a lot of conventional tests, those ranges are developed with the average population, not a healthy population as well, right? So that's taking the healthy and the sick and combining them all together, which is why you have, like you say, that line of fine where it's still within the range, but you're not actually optimal at optimal level, right?
Absolutely. And I think that that's really important to take into consideration. And, you know, I'm sure that there was a reason that they used a general population. Some people were thriving and some weren't in terms of it developing those ranges. But I know that a lot of my clients and clients who are working with naturopaths and other functional practitioners are in pursuit of something more. They're in pursuit of feeling more than just I'm okay on a daily basis. So it is something to consider when you are getting blood work back is I always encourage my clients to grab a copy of it. Just really like instead of just trusting that you are fine and taking that as word, ask for a copy, investigate those ranges. There's lots of information now out there where you can look up functional ranges for thyroid markers, and you can do a little bit of a deeper digging and check into that, which may help you actually be able to get diagnosed with an imbalance sooner so you're not becoming misdiagnosed. And or not just continuing to suffer without some answers as well.
And are there ways you can check your thyroid yourself without going in for blood work?
Yes and no. So there are some ways, obviously checking in with list of symptoms and things like that, but that's not going to tell you per se what's going on with your thyroid. But one thing that I think is important in terms of self-checking is checking for thyroid nodules or goiters. So any sort of imbalance and getting familiar with the texture, the shape, the size of your thyroid so that if you were to have some sort of abnormal growth or something like that, you yourself would be able to catch it early, much like we do a breast check exam. And for people, I recommend just tying this all together because we're already checking some of those tissues in that area as well. So a thyroid check is really important. And I advocate for this, especially I myself had thyroid cancer 5 years ago, and I didn't know anything about my thyroid or that I should be checking it or that it could grow and create abnormalities that we would actually be able to feel ourselves. So one is definitely, the self-check, but the second next best option in terms of checking your thyroid is to get a full thyroid panel with either your doctor, your naturopathic doctor, or a nurse practitioner as well. I should mention that there are a few kits that are available now through the internet where if you don't have access to that care, maybe in terms of expenses for insurance, you're not insured, you can purchase these thyroid test kits, which will test you a full thyroid blood work panel through a finger prick, which is also really great for people in terms of getting more direct answers for their thyroid health.
Awesome. And are you comfortable sharing a little bit more about your story? Because I'd love to know kind of what tipped you off to find out what was going on and kind of how that journey played out for you.
Yeah, I'd love to share a little bit about that. So I was actually diagnosed with Hashimoto's or underactive thyroid at the age of 19, which for me was quite young. I didn't have any education or really connection to my body at that time. I was going through university, just focused on my social life and, being a 19-year-old. And so I was put on thyroid medication, but really wasn't educated with respects to autoimmunity, what Hashimoto's does, and how do we care for our body when we have an autoimmune disease. And so I didn't address inflammation or anything else that we want to be really cautious of with respect to Hashimoto's. I also, so I was on thyroid medication for many years. And then about 9 years later, I would say that I went through what most people do in their 20s, trying to get into the work world and a little bit of overexerting yourself and burnout. And I was feeling fatigued all the time, but I wouldn't say I was cautiously like caring for my body, but I just knew that I wasn't feeling as energized as my friends around me. And it got to a point when I was 27 where I just woke up one day and I literally could not get out of bed. And I would define this now as like, HPA axis dysregulation or adrenal burnout. I knew something was deeply wrong with me and I just had no idea why. I knew I was taking my thyroid medication. Every year I would go in for a physical. They'd put me on a little bit of a higher dose. So I knew that things were getting worse and worse, but I didn't really take any preventative action or understand how to care for my body at that time. So I went into my doctor's office and I was very lucky that my doctor works in a hospital and she also had thyroid cancer herself less than 10 years before. And so she sent me up for a bunch of blood work and I got all the blood drawn and went for some scans and ultrasound of my thyroid. And I did have a large growth on my thyroid, which was then biopsied a few different times, and it came back as thyroid cancer. So I ended up having a total thyroidectomy at the age of 27. And that was a pretty scary time because obviously going from just being on thyroids, not knowing anything about your body, just kind of thinking you're doing the right thing, and to having lost your thyroid and having to be on medication, but also the impact of that on my body was pretty scary. And that really catapulted me into the work that I do now, is helping people really understand their body from a place of informed consent, but also advocate for better care and how to really take their health into their own hands.
Yeah, I can imagine that would have been a tough time and a moment of growth as well, I would assume, having to deal with
Absolutely.
all the emotions and thoughts that go on with that, but then also be pragmatic at the same time, right? Um,
Yeah, absolutely. I would say it really redefined me, and slowly there was like an evolution backwards of like, okay, I've, eliminated a lot of toxins and taken a really empowered approach to my body and my hormone health and what I put in my body and just really deep learning. So yeah, I'm really grateful that it happened to me, which is, ironic in terms of, talking about disease and diagnoses, because I feel like it did really wake me up into a new layer of like consciousness and connection to my body.
and what exactly is Hashimoto's?
Great question. So Hashimoto's is a autoimmune disease, and this is a disorder that can cause hypothyroidism or an underactive thyroid. And with any autoimmune disease, we have antibodies that start to attack a certain tissue. And so in this case with Hashimoto's, the immune system creates antibodies that start to attack your thyroid. From there, your thyroid can become very inflamed and sometimes create damage to the actual tissue, which would slow down your thyroid's ability to make thyroid hormone.
Okay, and knowing that it's an autoimmune disease, does that mean that you're at a greater likelihood of having other autoimmune conditions present in conjunction with Hashimoto's?
Absolutely. And I think that's always a valid concern for anyone with an autoimmune disorder because we have overactivation of our immune system, is that this could then stimulate other autoimmune processes in the body. And commonly, I will see clients come to see me with several autoimmune disorders. And we look at it kind of like unless we really work with the immune system and start to downregulate this inflammation and slow down the overactivation of the immune system, you're going to you have the potential to just start collecting these autoimmune diseases as the body becomes more inflamed and more stressed.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. You had mentioned that when you got your diagnosis for Hashimoto's, you weren't really well educated on the risks and some of the things you should do for prevention. So, can you share what those risks are? Like, does that automatically open you up to the risk of thyroid cancer or other conditions? And what are some of those steps that people can take to help reduce the risk factors?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So in clinical research, there is no direct correlation between developing Hashimoto's thyroiditis and ending up with thyroid cancer. In my head, it makes sense that if a tissue is inflamed or aggravated or being attacked, that we could then potentially have the potential for cellular abnormalities to develop. And so just so you know, if you do have Hashimoto's thyroiditis, this does not mean you will have thyroid cancer, but it doesn't also mean that it's off the table for you. In terms of risk factors for people with Hashimoto's thyroiditis in terms of development, women are more likely to develop Hashimoto's disease, so we should know that. Age is definitely a risk factor, and Hashimoto's can occur at any age, but it more commonly occurs in middle age, so women in their 30s and 40s, even in 50s, in terms of development. You are at higher risk of developing Hashimoto's if someone in your family has other autoimmune diseases or has thyroid imbalances as well. And once you have, like we talked about, have Hashimoto's, you are at a risk for developing other types of autoimmune disease, or vice versa. Like maybe you have type 1 diabetes or lupus or RA, and you then potentially could be at risk for developing Hashimoto's if we don't address the immune system as well. And sometimes people who have excessive amounts of environmental radiation are at increased risk for developing Hashimoto's. And I think this is important to talk about. I actually grew up within 30 kilometers of a nuclear power plant in the south end of Toronto. And so living near the lake there and being able to see the power plant, I actually never thought about radiation or exposure as a child, but now learning more about the risk correlations, I definitely see that that may have been a factor in the development of Hashimoto's for myself.
Wow, yeah, hindsight's always 2020, hey?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I work with clients who have Hashimoto's that are work in radiology labs, who are registered dental hygienists. Their exposure to radiation is high, even with the lead aprons and the lead walls and facilities and things like that, just like the micro radiations. So yeah, there's a lot of different environmental exposures and potentials for disease development. But I do think that there's an emotional and psycho-emotional component there too. You know, if you have an increase that they're in terms of risk factors with relationship to trauma, early childhood trauma, socioeconomic trauma, and things like that as well. So didn't want to leave that one off the table.
Fair. Now, you had mentioned that women are more likely to develop Hashimoto's. Why is that?
So that is a good question. Now, there's a lot of different schools of thought around this, but overall, women are 7 times more likely to develop Hashimoto's than men. And that is a huge number. Not to say that men do not have Hashimoto's, and I do know a lot of men with Hashimoto's. But in terms of this, some of the schools of thought are related to women actually having a placenta and the connection between having basically being able to carry a baby in pregnancy and having a placenta. I'd love to hear if you have any other, if you've heard of any other kind of connections to this with relationship to women having more levels of Hashimoto's than men, but that's the main one that pops up.
I actually haven't. I don't know much about Hashimoto's. Most of my thyroid knowledge and experience is more about just in general hypo or hyperthyroidism rather than the more specific conditions like Hashimoto's that is due to autoimmune issues, right? Um, so, do you know then if thyroid issues in general are more common to affect women over men as well?
Yes, they are. So more women do have underactive thyroid than men in terms of hypothyroidism. And again, it can be related to our sex hormones and regulation of those as well. Postpartum thyroid dysfunction occurs in about 10% of women after giving birth as well. So another kind of link to childbirth and having a more diverse sex hormone as well.
Okay, makes sense. So do you know why goiters are a common symptom that are associated with Hashimoto's?
Yes, so goiters are related to the deficiency of iodine. And so if we kind of break down in terms of thyroid hormone, the formation of thyroid hormone, we need, so T4 and T3, actually I would like to mention the full thyroid panel afterwards as well. But in terms of the formation of thyroid hormone itself, we need tyrosine and then we need iodine. So the T4 molecule is 1 tyrosine with 4 iodine, and then T3, again, tyrosine and 3 iodine. And so when we break that down in terms of goiters and the iodine deficiency, if we are deficient in something, it's kind of like the thyroid becomes starved. And when something and so that imbalance starts to create growth, abnormal growth of the thyroid or goiters within the thyroid tissue. And so typically it's related to absence of iodine or enough minerals in the diet. And that is actually why they started to add iodine into our table salts, and so that we can start to address like the mass prevalence of goiters in society, because we knew that we were stripping the soils from over farming and agricultural practices of iodine. They weren't being replenished into our soils, therefore they weren't making it onto our table. And so now we've added this iodine back into our table salt, so at least we get iodine on our table rather, in a daily practice, or like in a little bit more of an accessible way.
Okay. And do you know if athletic level or I guess high athletics, so more the elite or the people that are doing a lot of, say, hot yoga or things that they're sweating a lot where they're depleting their electrolytes, does that have an impact on your thyroid health as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Our thyroid is really regulated off of a lot of minerals, and those minerals play a role, like you mentioned, selenium as well. Those minerals play a role in thyroid hormone regulation, production, and also conversion. So we have to convert thyroid hormone from TSH, which comes from our pituitary gland, into T4, which is made in our thyroid. And then that needs to be converted inside of mostly our liver into T3, and also our gut into T3, which is the active hormone. The T3 then goes and will go into every cell in our body, which then sort of regulates and gives a feedback loop up to our pituitary gland, which will then be signaled to produce. That's sort of the whole connection, the feedback loop, to produce more TSH. So in terms of depleting a lot of those minerals, anywhere along that way in terms of conversion to other hormones, minerals are involved in that process. Enzymes are used, and enzymes need minerals to convert those hormones. So people who are sweating more, sweating period, but also, obviously in elite performing athletes, or, hot yoga, regular sauna users, cyclists, all of those people would need to intentionally replenish their electrolytes. And that's why you see things commonly talked about like electrolyte gel packs and things like that for marathon runners. We need to constantly replenish. Some of the easiest ways to do is using trace mineral drops into your water, or like I talked about, putting sea salt into your water. One of my favorite ways to replenish electrolytes first thing in the morning is just a quarter cup of coconut water with a pinch of sea salt as well. So it's a great source of a variety of minerals and electrolytes. And you see even in the sports world, Gatorade. I mean, obviously it's loaded with a lot of sugars and artificial colors and sweeteners like that, but it is a really great form of electrolyte. So you can make your own at-home electrolyte mix as well to replenish those lost minerals, so that we would then prevent the slowing down of our thyroid function as well.
Awesome. And you had mentioned that you wanted to talk about the thyroid panel. Do you want to start with what you would normally have ordered for a client?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of thyroid test, it is, most people will commonly know the thyroid test marker as TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone. And so it is also important to ask for free T4, which is the circulating T4 hormone, free T3, sometimes reverse T3. Some of your endocrinologists or doctors may, you may get a little bit of a pushback on reverse T3. And then in terms of antibodies, which will help with the diagnosis of Hashimoto's earlier, TPO antibodies, and then TG or thyroglobulin antibodies as well, in terms of inflammatory markers with relationship to your thyroid gland. So having those, I think it's 6 on a panel, is a really great place to start, especially if you do have that long laundry list of symptoms associated with either underactive thyroid, overactive thyroid, or Hashimoto's.
And do you ever have your patients do a toxic element or an essential element test as well?
Yes, so we do hair mineral analysis. So we take the most recent inch of growth from the back of their neck, and then we'll submit that into the lab, which is basically burned down into an ash and then assessed for trace minerals, and just to get an idea of mineral deficiencies that we could address early on in terms of thyroid health. If anybody's interested in asking their practitioner for that test, it is a hair mineral analysis test.
Fantastic. Okay, so if listeners want to work with you to address their thyroid or even get in touch to discuss where they're at, how could they go about doing that?
Yeah, so I share a lot of information if you're looking to learn a little bit more over on Instagram, and my handle is The Soulful Sprout. But on my website, I do have a lot of information with respect to the services, programs, and ways to work together. And my website is www.thesoulfulsprout.com.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me, Ashley. I think it's a really great topic, and the fact that you come from it from both the professional and that personal side, I think really gives a well-rounded perspective on the thyroid health picture as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. I'm glad I could share this information.
Wonderful, and thanks for the listeners for tuning in today as well. Thank you for listening to Supplementing Health. For more information about our guests, past shows, and future topics, please visit aor.ca/podcast or aor.us/podcast. Do you have a topic you want us to cover? We invite you to engage with us on social media to request a future topic, or email us at marketing@aor.ca.